Hello everyone, welcome to this module on IAM policies. My name is Rohit Rahi and I'm part of the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure team. In the simplest format, the policy syntax looks something like this. Allow subject to do something verb on specific resource types in location, which can be tenancy or compartment, and you can also add a condition here to make it more complex. But let's break it down into simpler terms, and then we can look into each in greater details. So as you can see here, first thing is there is no deny syntax because everything is denied by default. So you have to really explicitly allow. Otherwise, as we saw in the previous module, if you don't write a policy that's as good as writing a deny policy, you are basically locked out. You cannot do, your users cannot do anything in the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure environment. So subject here is your group, your group name, and the verb here, we have basically 4 types of verb going all the way from inspect, read, use to manage. Inspect basically means you can list your resources. Read and inspect, most of the cases are very similar. Read gives you some extra capabilities, like you can read, get this the metadata for the actual resources. In use, when you write a verb called use, you have the ability to read plus the ability to work with existing resources, like you could update the resource etc., depending on the type of resource you are trying to use. And then manage includes all the permissions for the resource. So if you're not very sure which verb to use, you can go with manage, or you could go with use, or you could even, if you want to just restrict the access, you could go with something like inspect or read, depending on your use cases. Now resource types basically are 2 kinds of resource types in OCI. One is the aggregate resource type, and then the second one is the individual resource type. As you can guess, aggregate resource type are tied to the various resources you have in OCI. So the simplest way to look at it is, if you want to give somebody access to everything in OCI, just go with this resource type called all dash resources, which means every resource in OCI, all resources in OCI. If that is not what you want to give access to your users, you could go granular. So if you just want to restrict access to database, you could say database family, instance family, virtual network family, and so on and so forth. If you want to go very granular within virtual network family, you could have VCNs, subnets, route tables, so on and so forth. The whole idea is you can be very granular and provide role-based access control. And you can read more on the documentation as to what specific resource types are available, what are the individual resource types, and how you combine the various verbs with these resource types. There are good documentation pages on those. Now in reality, what is happening is, when you write a policy giving a group access to a particular verb and resource type, you're actually giving that group access to one or more predefined permissions. We're just making it simpler for you. So what does that look like? So for example, look at something like a volumes family, block volume family. So the various verbs which are possible, again, shouldn't be surprised, is inspect, read, use, manage, the 4 tiers we had on the previous slide. And behind the scene, you have permissions tied to each of these verbs, and again behind the scene, the permissions are tied to the API operations. So for example, as you go from inspect to read to use to manage, the level of access generally increases. So you see something like read plus. So use has everything here on inspect and read, plus ability to update, as I was saying in the previous slide, ability to write, but not delete, for example, right, or create. So if you go to manage, you could use everything in use, plus you get 2 capabilities to create volumes and delete volumes. Now everything in the cloud is, you are calling APIs, right? It's all the web services. Now each API operation requires the caller to have access to one or more permissions. So for example, if you want to list volumes or get volumes, these two APIs, you need to have this permission called volume inspect. If you want to create a volume, you need the create volume API needs access to volume underscore create permission. And how do you get that permission? By writing a policy which says allow specific group to manage volume family in either a tenancy or account or compartment. So this is how behind the scene policies work. This portion here on permissions, API operations are all abstracted, so you don't have to go this granular and figure out which APIs are tied to which permissions and which permissions are tied to which verbs, because it can get very complex very soon. So it just makes life easier by giving you verbs. But remember, behind the scenes there are permissions predefined, and then the APIs are tied, require those specific permissions in order to be executed. Okay, so alright, let's look at some of the common policies. A very simple policy. Let's start with, you want network admins to manage a cloud network, right? So you would write something like allow group, let's say this is a group here, group name, to manage, this is your verb, highest level of access, virtual network family, means everything which is provided by virtual networks, your subnets, your route tables, your gateways, your different kinds of constructs, all part of the virtual network family. And you could write this policy either in a compartment or a tenancy, right? In this case I'm doing it in a tenancy, which means it's at the account level, but you could also go very granular. Now if you want users to launch compute instances, it gets a little bit more complex, right? First thing when you launch a compute instance is you need virtual network family, because a instance is launched within a subnet. So you need to write a policy here. Now you see, in this case I don't need manage, because this user is just using a subnet. It's not creating a new subnet in most of the cases, right? So use is fine because it doesn't need to create or delete, and then delete the subnet or the virtual cloud network. And then you need these other verbs, right? So you need a manage here, because you can create an instance, you can delete an instance, right? So you need that manage, and then you need a couple of other policies. For example, if instances, probably you need to have block volumes if you're creating any application, so you would use the volume family. And again, see, volume family, you are not creating a new volume, you're probably, somebody has created that volume, you're using it, so you say use here. So you can see how you can write simple policies and you can write complex policies. And the link here, if you go to this link, you can see a collection of various policy. There's a whole list of something like 50 or 100 policies, different scenarios, which are all listed there. Lastly, there is this concept of advanced policy syntax, where you can write a conditional policy. Now we, again, in the level 200 videos, we go into more details, but let me just quickly cover this here. So when you write a condition, you need to add variables, and when you are adding variables, there are two kinds of variables you can use. One is called request, one is called target. So request is something which is relevant to the request itself. Okay, so what does that mean? If you have an operation, you're doing some API operation, like you're trying to list users, you could say something like request.operations. This represents the API operation which you are executing. For example, list users. Target.group.name represents the name of the group. So you have target here, group.name is the name of the group, and to specify that, you would use a keyword like target.group.name. So a good example is, and as you see here, variable name is prefixed accordingly with either the request.operation, or target followed by a period. So request.operation, target.something group name. Now you can see the example here. Allow group, this is a group name, to manage all resources, meaning they have permissions to do everything. Basically they are administrators for this particular account, where request.region, meaning this is the region where the request is being made, is Phoenix. So this means you have an admin for Phoenix, but they cannot do anything in the other 10 regions which are there. So again, if you go to this link, you can see the policy references, and you can all read a lot about advanced policies. Let me close this module by quickly showing you the demo where we left in the last module. So in the last module, we created a user, training user 1, and we created a group called training group. We added that user to the training group, and that's all we did. We didn't write a policy, we didn't touch anything on the compartments, none of that, right? So first thing let's do here is write a policy. Now you can see there are 3 policies here, and I'm still in the root compartment. What does that mean? We'll talk more in the next module, so don't worry. But policies need to live somewhere. You need to attach it either to a compartment or a tenancy. You just cannot keep, leave it hanging somewhere. You have to attach it. Otherwise, if you create a compartment, for example, don't attach a policy. It's not useful. So let's create a policy here, training policy, and this is my training policy. And I need to write a statement here, right? So the first statement I want to write is allow group. We created this group just a while back in the previous, to manage. Now I don't want to do all resources. I just want to do virtual network family. And as I said, let's allow this in the whole tenancy, because it shouldn't matter, but let's just do this. So we created we created a policy here, right? So what it's saying is this particular group and all the users which belong to that group can manage a virtual network family. So they can create one, they can delete one, they can update one, and all that, right? So I'm logged in as training user 1 here, and earlier in the previous video you saw that this user could not do anything in this account because they had no policies written for their specific group. But as you can see here, now I see various networks, and if I click here and I say I want to create a test VCN, and root is fine, I want to just create a network and click create virtual cloud network, you could see that I'm able to create a virtual cloud network here. It's that simple, right? The policy basically unlocks my permission, so I can execute it and I can create a network. But if I go to the compute instance and I want to, let's say, create a compute instance, right? You see it's grayed out here. I cannot click on create instance and create one, even though it will show you a menu or something. You probably would not be able to create an instance here, right? If I click on that, it will not let me do that. Why? Because I really haven't written any permissions to allow me to create instances. So let's change that. If I go back, I can add a policy statement here, and I have one which I just wrote before I was doing this class. So I create this policy. It says allow group training group to manage instance family, and again, remember instance family, you could create an instance, you can delete an instance, you could basically do everything around the instances. Now if I refresh this page, just look here, earlier it said I don't have any permissions. If I refresh this page, you can see that I would start seeing instances there, and I can actually go and create instance now, right? It would let me do that. So let me just quickly run it here. Give a default name, choose an AD. I'm not even choosing some of these values there. This is the network we just created. I'm not giving an SSH keys or anything, it's just a dummy example, and I click create, and you would see within a few seconds my instance would be up and running. So this is a quick example. We wrote 2 policies, first to unlock the virtual cloud network, give the permissions to create a VCN, and then couldn't do anything beyond VCN. We wrote another policy to give me access to create instances, and now I'm able to create instances. So this is how policies work. It gets more complex with conditional policies, where you attach the policies and all that. We'll cover those in the subsequent lectures. Thanks for joining this particular lecture. If you have some time, please join the next lecture where we talk about compartments. Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome to